Tonight at 10, cooperate or perish. The grim warning to the nations of the world on the threat posed by climate change. As leaders gather in Egypt for the latest climate summit, the UN tells them that progress on limiting emissions and global warming is woefully inadequate.
We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
The measures to combat climate change, which were agreed last year, have seen very little progress, despite more evidence of the devastation that's being caused.
Climate security goes hand in hand with energy security. Putin's abhorrent war in Ukraine and rising energy prices across the world are not a reason to go slow on climate change.
But there have been some positive developments here in Egypt, an agreement to discuss payments towards the impact climate change is already having.
Yes, we'll have the very latest on the first day's deliberations at the climate summit in Egypt, also tonight. 5 years after the fire at Grenfell Tower, which claimed 72 lives, the official public inquiry is drawing to a close. Biden rallies the party troops for the midterm elections, while Trump is still claiming the presidential election was stolen. We report on the increasingly deep divisions in American society.
How fast could you run in these slippers when you were a kid?
And the star comedian Peter Kay announces his long-awaited return to the road with his first live tour in 12 years.
And in London at 10:30, on the day world leaders gather for COP27, climate change activists bring parts of the M25 to a standstill.
Good evening. The Global Climate Summit, known as COP27, has started in Egypt with the darkest of warnings from the head of the United Nations. Antonio Guterres said that the world was on the highway to climate hell, with no sign of slowing down, and that humanity needed to cooperate or perish. He declared that the climate crisis was now the defining issue of our times. Well, last year's climate conference in Glasgow did actually agree a number of pledges on cutting emissions, on phasing down, as they say, the use of coal, on stopping deforestation, cutting levels of methane. But the UN says that progress on cutting emissions certainly has been woefully inadequate. The planet has already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times, and scientists have long insisted that going beyond a rise of 1.5 degrees would see catastrophic effects for people all over the world. Well, without urgent action, the world is now on track for a devastating 2.7 degree increase by the end of the century. That's according to the Climate Action Tracker website. Our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt, is at the summit in Egypt, and he sent this report.
You'll have noticed it has been wet, and there will be more severe rain this winter, the Environment Agency said today, as it tries to raise awareness of the risks of floods. And it warns climate change will bring more extreme weather our way. In the Egyptian desert, world leaders have been gathering to try and tackle the climate challenge, including the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, arriving in Egypt for what are expected to be some of the most difficult discussions in the 3-decade history of these climate summits.
Global temperatures keep rising, and our planet is fast approaching tipping points that will make climate chaos irreversible. We are on a highway to climate hell with our foot still on the accelerator.
Mr. Sunak said acting on climate also makes economic sense.
Putin's abhorrent war in Ukraine and rising energy prices across the world are not a reason to go slow on climate change. They are a reason to act faster.
But developing nations say they need the rich world to deliver on its promises of finance.
This backdrop, the lengthy discussions at COPs, with its stalling, delaying tactics and procrastination that have hampered implementation and delivery, is simply cruel and unjust.
It has been a year of climate-related disasters around the world. Dry weather in the North African country of Mauritania led to extensive fires last month. At the Glasgow Climate Conference last year, countries agreed to raise their carbon-cutting ambitions every year. But just 29 out of 193 have done so, and only one of them, Australia, significantly raised its game. So where does that leave us? So take a look at this. This is how much emissions have been growing. They've been increasing steadily. Now, the UN says we need to cut them almost in half by 2030, so in just 7 years' time. But this is the direction the world is currently going. Now, the UN says that puts us on track for a temperature rise of almost 3 degrees centigrade. It would be, it says, a catastrophe for humanity. For the first time in the history of these conferences, there is a dedicated youth zone, and the young people are frustrated.
Nothing new has been said. This is the 27th COP of its kind. It's older than I am.
We're not just here as symbols of the future. We're here as representatives of the climate crisis being lived through us. My hometown flooded in Mexico when I was 13 years old. That's why I'm a climate activist.
We keep having to pressure them, and that is why we are here as the young people applying that pressure, and why we won't back down, because we believe that another world is possible, and it is possible to make those policy changes.
What do we want? These young people worry their voice isn't being heard, however loud they are. But they hope that by being here at the conference, they will begin to influence the decisions that will shape all our futures. Justin Rolat, BBC News, Egypt.
Well, as we heard in Justin's report there, one of the key issues is compensating poorer countries. Among those is Pakistan, which suffered devastating floods earlier this year. More than 1,500 lives were lost, more than 2 million homes devastated, along with infrastructure, including roads and bridges. Around 30,000 hospitals and schools were also damaged or destroyed. The Pakistan government has put the overall cost of the floods at the equivalent of some $30 billion. Our South Asia correspondent, Rajini Vaidyanathan, reports now from the southwestern province of Balochistan.
The waters came, wrecking everything in their path. The classroom block at Orak Boys' School stood no chance. One small mercy is that no one was inside at the time. Rahan watched as his school turned to ruin.
I was standing on the hill when I saw the water and rocks gushing down. Our classroom was destroyed. We even lost our playground.
Claimed by a catastrophe, Pakistan's government says is due to climate change. Another tale of devastation at the girls' school close by. And an early lesson in resilience. In these socially conservative districts, where many girls aren't allowed to attend school, it was already tough to get an education. Now they're learning in tents. 15-year-old Aisha is determined to become a doctor.
I missed my classroom. We had desks and we didn't have to sit on the floor. My dream is for my school to be rebuilt.
Brick by brick, recovery is slow. Abdul Qayyum collects the fragments of the home, which was in his family for a century.
My daughter is desperate to move back here. Day and night she asks for her bedroom. I'm scared to rebuild here in case it floods again.
This part of Balochistan doesn't get much rain, let alone flash floods. But this year they arrived with force, the water destroying not just homes and schools, but roads and bridges. An entire landscape redrawn. It could take a lot of time and money to rebuild. A monsoon on steroids, says the UN. This was the wettest August ever for these southern provinces. Pakistan's only responsible for a tiny fraction of global emissions. The country's Prime Minister told a meeting at COP27 that the West needs to compensate poorer nations like his.
Some countries, namely Pakistan, will be more exposed, more deeply vulnerable than others living in cooler longitudes. In my country, Secretary General, millions of people are going into winter without the shelter or livelihood.
Millions remain homeless, already struggling through an economic crisis. A climate disaster has plunged them into further despair. The waters may have receded, but here they still feel stranded. Rajini Vaidyanathan, BBC News, Balochistan.
Well, in his address to the COP27 summit, the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said it was morally and economically right to tackle climate change and to reduce energy dependency. His message was echoed by his predecessor, Boris Johnson, who's also attending COP27, who called on leaders not to weaken their commitment to net zero. That's the means of cutting greenhouse gas emissions to as close to zero as possible. Our political editor, Chris Mason, is travelling with the Prime Minister and sent this report.
This is what international diplomacy looks and sounds like, or at least what the Egyptian hosts want us to see and hear. Ceremony, serenity, smiles, handshakes.
Bring forward, bring forward.
Inside, in often cramped meeting rooms, it looks rather more like this. Here was the Prime Minister meeting the President of the European Commission this morning. After a room and flag change, it was the new Prime Minister of Italy next.
Right, brilliant. Let's go.
Pardon. And, oh, the camera's running. Look energetic. President Emmanuel Macron of France. A chance to talk climate, but also try to sort other things out, like those risking their lives crossing the Channel in small boats.
There is an opportunity for us to work closely, not just with the French, but with other countries as well. You will hear more details about that in the coming weeks as those conversations happen amongst all our teams. But I'm actually leaving this with renewed confidence and optimism that working together with our European partners, we can make a difference.
It's not the honest truth that your Home Secretary, the person you chose to appoint as Home Secretary just 6 days after she'd resigned from that post, has made the situation worse, made it worse at Manston, where plenty of people, according to some, have been held unlawfully.
Look, the Home Secretary is actually at the moment making sure that we reduce the numbers at Manston, and we're making very good progress on that.
Look who's also turned up, the Prime Minister before last. What on earth is he doing here?
I'm worried that because of what's happening in Ukraine, because of the pressure on fuel prices and all that, people are going soft on the idea of tackling climate change.
Backseat driving? There was no direct answer, but there was a speech.
Hey, slow down immediately. That's it. Game over.
I'm here as a foot soldier and spear carrier of the Conservative. I'm here in a purely supportive role.
Boris Johnson has said he is here in a purely supportive role. How would you describe it?
Oh, it's great that the former Prime Minister is here, and I think it says something. I think it says something great about the UK, that not only have we got the current Prime Minister here, we've got a former Prime Minister here. It just demonstrates our leadership on this issue globally.
As Chancellor during the pandemic, we got a sense of Rishi Sunak's priorities, but now he's on the world stage as a leader, and we wait to see what his instincts are as Prime Minister, particularly on foreign affairs. His challenge here, fulfilling expensive promises at a time of a squeeze at home. The new Prime Minister's flying home tonight, his dash to the Egyptian sand done. The colossal scale of his task just beginning. Chris Mason, BBC News in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Let's try and sum up what's been going on there today with our climate editor Justin Rowlatt, who joins us now in Sharm el-Sheikh. Mentioned earlier, Justin, some good news today. Tell us a little more about that.
Yes, let's focus on the good news. The positive development, I suppose the most positive one, was the decision to include loss and damage for the first time in these talks. Now, loss and damage is pretty much what it says on the tin. It's about the loss and damage climate change is currently causing. So developing countries, I should say, are often experience more extreme weather events associated with climate change. Think floods, storms, droughts, and they're often less able to cope with them. So they've been saying for a long time they would like the rich world to help them out with this loss and damage. Now, the rich world, which caused climate change, burning the fossil fuels that made it rich, has always pushed back on that. They're very anxious about signing up to what could be an open-ended commitment, particularly as the impacts of climate change get worse. The costs could run into hundreds of millions, trillions in the future. So they've always said they didn't want to do it, so it is significant to have it on the agenda. But, and this is a big but, what has actually been agreed is that there will be cooperation and facilitation talks towards a funding mechanism rather than compensation and liability. What on earth does that mean, Hugh? Well, what it means is they've actually agreed to talk about the possibility of future financing system rather than any hard cash. Now, by UN standards, that is progress, albeit actually quite small.
When we talked earlier, Justin, we did mention the fact that the UN had talked of woefully inadequate progress since Glasgow on some measures. Do you think that COP27 will lead to a more positive outcome overall?
Well, listen, that is the agenda the Egyptians have. They're absolutely determined. They say this is going to be an implementation summit. What they mean by that is this is all about delivering on promises. We don't want more aspirations and pledges. They say we want delivery. But delivery is a much bigger challenge because essentially delivery means cash. Getting the development.
Well, I'm sorry, we seem to lose the link there to Justin in Sharm el-Sheikh, but thankfully, I think he'd made the principal points there about the hopes of the Egyptians of really building on the foundations that were laid in Glasgow last year in COP26. But of course, COP27 now a different story. If you want more details on what's been discussed at COP27 and what's happened since last year, what households and businesses can do to reduce climate emissions, well, have a look at this special section on the website, bbc.co.uk/news, and you'll see the various aspects there discussed for you. Let's move on to some of the day's other news. 5 years after the fire at Grenfell Tower in West London, in which 72 people lost their lives, the official public inquiry is drawing to a close. Today, lawyers for the bereaved families made their closing statements after thousands of hours of evidence and cross-examination, which included debate on fire regulations and the type of cladding used on the building. As our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons reports, the conduct of the construction industry, of council officials, successive governments and global corporations, all of that is under scrutiny.
Grenfell's victims and some of its perpetrators come from all over the world, but this disaster was made in Britain.
What is striking about the British government's handling of these issues is the startling ignorance of those supposedly in charge.
Over the years, this inquiry has pieced together the details of what went wrong. Today was about the big picture.
What is it about modern Britain that allowed the grave wrongs of industry to take root, for the emergency response to crash, and for its socially housed population to be treated as objects and problems, rather than people with rights worthy of respect?
As it tackled the question of who was to blame for Grenfell, the inquiry found companies and organisations blamed each other. Another barrister for victims of the fire wasn't surprised.
The very structure of the construction industry was one of buck passing, and the buck was being passed between incompetents. The main aim of each individual organisation was to get the buck off their desk and onto someone else's.
Stephanie Barwise Casey named 3 companies responsible for the use of unsafe materials at Grenfell. She said that Arconic manufactured cladding knowing that it performed poorly in fire safety tests. Studio E, the architects, were accused of not knowing enough about the risks of fire safety. And Exova, a fire safety consultant gave advice early in the refurbishment project that it would not adversely affect safety. She said there had to be major reforms.
If the inquiry can affect this sea change, it will be a turning point in the industry's long history.
The inquiry's under pressure to deliver that. Some Grenfell families are not confident. They're looking for prosecutions of the companies involved. And
it seems to our clients that what is now required from each of them is an unequivocal, unambiguous and forthright apology.
there were also calls for a national memorial day to remember the 72 lives lost in this disaster. Tom Simons, BBC News, at the Grenfell Tower inquiry.
Now let's have a look at some of the other stories making the news today. And most train companies have again run a reduced timetable today, despite the fact that 3 days of strikes by the RMT union have been called off. Companies say it was too late for many services to be reinstated. The Manchester City footballer Benjamin Mendy has been giving evidence in his rape trial, telling Chester Crown Court that he enjoyed having sex with a lot of women. Mendy said that women were attracted to him for his status and not his looks, and he didn't know he could hurt their feelings if they'd agreed to have sex. He denies 7 counts of rape, 1 attempted rape and sexual assault against 6 women. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has announced that plans for a national flagship, seen as a replacement for the Royal Yacht Britannia, have been dropped. He told MPs he had directed the termination of the national flagship competition with immediate effect in order to invest in ocean surveillance vessels. Now, voters in the United States will take part in the crucial midterm elections tomorrow, when members of the US Congress will be elected. Our usual reminder that Congress is split into the House of Representatives, that's the lower house, a bit like the House of Commons, and then the US Senate, the elected upper house, which revises legislation. There are 100 senators, each one serves 6-year terms. Now, for the past 2 years, the Democratic Party, Mr. Biden's party, has controlled both House and Senate, which has allowed the president to pass the laws that he wants. But if either the House or the Senate, or indeed both of them, become controlled by the Republicans after these elections, well, the president's agenda is likely to be blocked. Now, the campaign has, to an extent, been dominated by issues such as immigration, crime, cost of living, abortion rights, but it's also been dominated by this man, President Trump, again likely to have a big impact on the election. He has signalled that he wants to run again for the presidency. For many, the bigger picture is of a deeply divided society. Some Americans, however, don't regret those divisions. The BBC's Justin Webb considers how power has been shifting from Washington to the individual states of the Union.
America has, sometimes, been united. The Apollo missions, the first man on the moon, were a source of national pride. But it came at the end of a rough decade. A decade of struggle for civil rights, of resistance, of assassination.
Never have so many people participated in an event with such a feeling of hope and friendship.
So united, yes, but disunited as well. You can overemphasize the idea that Americans were ever entirely on the same page. But the compelling narrative since the Second World War was of progress, and national progress, the whole nation moving on, facing challenges, extending rights for all Americans.
Good evening. In a landmark ruling, the Supreme Court today legalized abortions.
As the Supreme Court did repeatedly, and famously with Roe v. Wade, that gave all American women the right to an abortion.
This great nation will endure.
It didn't matter who was in power. From Franklin Roosevelt and his post-Depression New Deal, the direction seemed clear. Even the sunny opponent of liberal America, Ronald Reagan, who changed so much in the 1980s, didn't alter the fundamental view of national progress and national rights that by definition everyone could access.
I am not frightened by what lies ahead, and I don't believe the American people are frightened by what lies ahead.
But now Roe v. Wade is gone. and perhaps a lot more. The Trump-appointed justices here at the Supreme Court have got the bit between their teeth. The Conservative majority on the court seem to want a grand reset, along with millions of Americans who never really signed up for national progress, national rights. They want less power here in Washington and much more in the individual states. The birth of this new settlement, if that's what it is hard fought. This summer, governors from Texas and Florida flew migrants who'd crossed from Mexico up to posh Martha's Vineyard, an upmarket holiday island off the northeast coast. These Venezuelans were caught in the crossfire of a row between state governments that feel overwhelmed by illegal immigration and a smart set, a national rights set, wealthy left-wing Americans who, in the view of the governors, tend to employ South Americans as gardeners but otherwise not think too much about them. These conflicts might grow in the new America.
Freedom? It's under attack in your state.
Of course, some state governors will seize the power to keep their idea of progress alive. They'll make use of the freedoms the court seems happy for them to have, provided the nation doesn't have to follow. Governors like Gavin Newsom in California.
Don't let them take your freedom.
California, huge, racially diverse, economically powerful, wants to fight climate change, and it does, imposing strict rules on the emissions of the vehicles that gum its big cities, allowing easy access to abortion too in the post-Roe v. Wade world, but as a policy, not as a universal American right. Ever since the events of January the 6th here at Capitol Hill, there's been loose talk of a new civil war in America. It's not impossible, but perhaps way more likely is a state-by-state idea of the nation. In a sense, the original idea, fractured, but still in business. Justin Webb, BBC News, Washington.
Now, one of Britain's most popular comedians, Peter Kay, is to go back on the road. It's his first live tour in 12 years. His last stand-up tour achieved a Guinness World Record for the biggest selling run of all time, performing in front of more than 1 million people. Our entertainment correspondent, Colin Patterson, picks up the story.
Hey, look, it's Peter Kay. Hey, garlic bread!
Peter Kay announcing his first stand-up for 12 years in a very Peter Kay way.
Hey, when are you back on tour? Next month.
His last record-breaking tour was seen by more than 1 million people.
Just let me state for the record.
But in 2017, plans to go back on the road were cancelled due to unforeseen family circumstances, right after the tour had sold out.
This is 96.5 Bolton FM.
The long wait had added to the excitement. In his hometown, Bolton FM were dedicating their afternoon show to the news.
What are you smoking at?
What am I smoking at? Have you not heard the news?
What news?
Peter Kay.
Oh, of course I've heard the news. That lad is comedy gold, let me tell you. Bolton born and garlic bread.
He represents everything about families and, you know, because his comedy just reaches across all generations. But also as well, I think, like, for everybody in the whole of the country who loves Peter Kay, because he's not been around for so long, everybody's missed him, and also as well, you know, we need a laugh.
And in the town centre, it was a major talking point.
He's just got a generally down-to-earth way of making people laugh, and that's a talent in itself, isn't it?
Pretty funny lad. If he's coming back, I'll be happy lad, because he went to my high school. At the assembly, Peter Kay went here, so you ever looked up to someone?
It's his classic garlic bread line, isn't it?
Garlic bread, you're joking!
Early in his career, Peter Kay played a landmark show here at Bolton's Albert Halls. Of course, every venue on this tour is an arena.
Is this the way to Amarillo?
Peter Kay has acknowledged the cost of living crisis by putting tickets on sale starting at £35, the same price they were when he last toured.
Did you get your mum that bungalow?
Yeah, he wants a new carpet now.
And one place the announcement has caused extra excitement, Bolton's carpet shops.
Yeah, if it means I'm getting a ticket, I'm doing him a deal. Definitely. Shh, the boss is in there.
Colin Patterson, BBC News, Bolton.
We're looking forward to that. That's an understatement. It's 29 minutes past 10. Time for a look at the weather. Hi, Louise.
Hi there, Hugh. Not a particularly inviting picture, is it, at the moment? This is how we said
goodbye to daylight hours in Cornwall. And in fact, some of the rain really has turned quite heavy over the last few hours. It's a fairly narrow band, but it's being accompanied by gusts of wind 60, 70 miles an hour. So that is going to drive its way steadily eastwards over the next few hours. So a lot of heavy rain in a short space of time may well lead to some localised flooding in one or two spots. And certainly it is going to be moving at quite a pace as those strong, squally winds push it through. Now, that is probably welcome news in some respects, because it means by dawn it'll be sitting out in the North Sea, and then behind it there will be quite a clearance. It's going to be a mild start as well, double figures for many, and we start off maybe tomorrow with a little bit more sunshine than we've seen today. But those strong winds staying with us, and they're going to be driving in plenty of showers from the west, some of those pushing further inland as we go through the afternoon. So a blustery day, some sharp showers, heavy, thundery ones as well, with those strong winds rattling through quite quickly. So top temperatures tomorrow looking at 11 to 15 degrees, still relatively mild for the time of year. Now, high pressure is going to build towards the end of the week and sit across Europe. That's going to be important. It's going to dry things up, keep those weather fronts out to the northwest, but still that southerly flow driving in that milder air. So we are likely to see temperatures peaking at around 17 degrees on Thursday. Look at where they should be at this time of year. So it's going to stay mild despite the cloud, the wind and the rain. There you go, Hugh.
Louise, thanks very much. And that's BBC News at 10 on Monday, the 7th of November. Of course, the usual nightly reminder, more analysis of the day's main stories on Newsnight. That's over on BBC Two, and it's my colleague Victoria Derbyshire, who's just preparing to go on air there. But here on BBC One, well, all of our colleagues in the nations and regions are standing by with the news wherever you are tonight. But from the 10 team, thanks for watching and good night.